In Return of the Obra Dinn, you play as an insurance agent, tasked with investigating the abandoned ship which has drifted into Falmouth Harbour in 1807, years after being lost at sea. But despite the historical setting, the narrative of Obra Dinn is, at heart, a celebration of a slightly more modern storytelling medium, hypermedia. If you purchased a Macintosh computer from 1987 onwards, you would find that it came free with a program called HyperCard. Designed by Bill Atkinson, HyperCard was intended to be a highly accessible software development kit. Authors created virtual stacks of virtual cards, much like a paper filing system, but with text, images, and navigation all seamlessly integrated and connected.
Joining us in the studio now is Bill Atkinson. Bill is an Apple Fellow, the creator of HyperCard, also the creator of QuickDraw and Mac Paint. Next to Bill is Dan Winkler. Dan is the senior engineer at Apple working on the HyperCard project. Gary?
Stuart, a HyperCard sounds like a hardware board you'd put into your computer system, but this particular HyperCard comes in 4 floppy disks. Would you tell us what the HyperCard's all about, Bill?
Well, really simply put, HyperCard is a software erector set. It lets non-programmers put together interactive information.
Show us how you actually do this, Bill.
You use cards that contain graphics and text and buttons. Here I've got a stack of cards and I can press on this button and it will take me to another card.
Okay, and that button's particular function is get to the next card.
Right. You can have lots of buttons to do different things.
Okay.
Buttons can do things like dialing the phone and taking you to cards and lots of different
Whatever
things.
you tell it to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
The cards are grouped together into stacks that you put on a floppy disk and can share with somebody else. And you can organize it so that any card can jump to any other card.
Is this where you get that notion of hypertext built into the HyperCard system?
Yeah, it's kind of the freedom to organize the information according to how things are associated with each other, not just according to the next card in the list.
Right, okay.
This freedom from list view is the essence of hypermedia. Rather than the linear experience you would get from a novel, music, or film, the links in hypermedia allow the user to guide the flow of information per their requirements. HyperCard was a combination of hyperlinking, in which text can be moved through by clicking, and multimedia, meaning that rather than just text, audio and images could be part of these connective gateways. Despite HyperCard's tutorial presenting a fairly tame digital Rolodex, the sheer potential of hypermedia naturally led software authors to exciting new places. Those creators were often fascinated with the meeting of mediums that this interface enabled. Here, for example, musician Robert Winter talks about this HyperCard program designed as a companion to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony.
Beethoven's Ninth Symphony exhibits a very profound structure. Music is structure over time, and in one sense, this is the natural flow of life, which after all takes place in time. But this also creates great obstacles for the listener, because unlike a painting, for example, Picasso's Guernica, where you can take in the entire canvas at one look and focus on that portion which you wish to study or peruse, with music, you haven't got that liberty. However, imagine that we were able to freeze time and to create, as it were, a kind of picture of the piece, as here. And here we have, for example, the various movements, all 4 of them, the portions of the movements, the exposition, the development, the recapitulation, and so forth, and that we can at will, for example, pick on any of them. Unlike any composer before him, rather than presenting us with a full-blown theme, Beethoven takes us back to the very process of creation. We kind of come out of this void, and this little unit of energy, a tatam figure, which is all there is there at this hushed beginning, grows gradually in intensity. And little by little, it's as if we're watching the 20-year growth of a mighty oak tree compressed into 40 seconds, so that finally it just bursts out of the texture and explodes.
interactions offered new spaces to think about the relationships between traditional mediums, and for some, offered the potential for whole new worlds. Authors began using HyperCard's accessible programming language to make video games, building upon the small but unique library of odd Mac titles such as Dark Castle to create games with a slower pace than their console counterparts. Brothers Rand Miller and Robin Miller, after using HyperCard's tools to create several children's adventure games, used the program to create the legendary puzzle game MYST. It was during this period that Obra Dinn developer Lucas Pope was really getting into computers, and for him, much like the other HyperCard authors, the software combined art, sound and programming in the perfect way. So it's clear that this period of Macintosh computing was important to Pope and to Obra Dinn's development, and it has influenced the game on multiple levels. The most obvious is the visual style. Using 1-bit graphics was actually one of the earliest decisions Pope made when concepting Obra Dinn. This homage gave the game a distinct look, immediately setting it apart from other modern 3D games. The style of course stemmed from using classic Macintosh computers in the early 90s, and Pope co-opted their low resolution and single colour displays into the style. When prototyping the game, he even tried out a CRT effect, giving the whole screen a curved look and rounded edges to emulate the shape of a classic monitor. Other game designers have used similar techniques, using the physical presence of such displays to provide context and content to their stories. In Pony Island, an obscure arcade cabinet contains ancient secrets, whilst in Her Story, an archaic police database is a fragmented link to the past. For Obra Dinn, however, making the display technology so explicitly present was a step too far. The player's character was supposed to be an insurance agent in 1807, and leaning so hard on the early computing style threatened to suck the player out into another level of frame narrative. You could almost imagine this version of the game starting in the early 90s as the player discovers a mysterious salt-encrusted floppy disk washed up on a beach. Taking it home to their Macintosh Plus, where they pop it into the disk drive and find themselves transported to 1807. This wasn't where Pope wanted his players' attentions. He wanted the Obra Dinn itself to be the focus. The game took place on an old ship, not an old computer, and this level of homage was just too distracting, so the CRT frame was left on the drawing board. Overall, rather than recalling just the visuals from his childhood computing adventures, it's actually the underlying attitude and philosophy of the HyperCard era that Pope places at the heart of Obra Dinn. The whole of Return of the Obra Dinn is a celebration of Hypermedia, as you interact with the game space by clicking to traverse through various databases, moving through pages, pictures, lists, and even travelling through time with a flick of your pocket watch. Players must traverse this sea of media, which echoes so much of the style and attitude of these HyperCard creations. Much like Bill Atkinson when he created HyperCard, Pope challenges players to free themselves from the list view and use his tools to create new associations. You may find bodies on the Obra Dinn in one order, but to complete the game, you must constantly be reordering this information, sometimes chronologically to understand the plot, perhaps by location to examine a certain place, or by rank via the crew list, all the while combining fragmented sound, image and text media to build your complete knowledge. Players are free to come to their conclusions in any order they like, and to revisit and recontextualise any evidence as they see fit. As the player gathers their information, they fill a database, almost like the practice mode of the original software. Pope has brought us full circle through all the inventive uses for HyperCard, back to its most basic premise: data entry in a book of contacts. Many writers have tried to create hypermedia stories, but it is not easy to make a comprehensible narrative from diffuse media, especially with a large cast and jumbled chronology. Pope has of course embraced this difficulty by folding it into the gameplay and story, making Obra Dinn a work of investigation. You play as an insurance agent, and whilst discovering the exacting data your job requires, Pope is creating a subversive undercurrent to the story. This grand tale of mystery and horror is reduced to the sort of minute details which would often go ignored in a traditional drama. Pope purposefully focuses on mundane human interactions and the workmanlike aspects of the ship. This is where clues tend to be found. By concentrating on these human elements, you may start to care about all these disposable lives that you are actually cataloguing for disposal. Ultimately, your job here is to unburden the East India Company of its final responsibility to these men, to judge them and calculate the cold financial result of their demise. The irony is taken to an almost absurd level when you're busily examining a scene of spectacular madness and have to consider, well, was this fellow technically crushed or struck in his battle against this particular arcane ocean horror? The business is not interested in the actual story of what has occurred beyond these technical details. The gameplay renders the specifics of these deaths with this detached approach that creates appreciation for how truly cheap these sailors' lives would have been. Like many works of horror, the most dangerous threat is actually not from any beast, but the actions of humankind. Here we see the greed of expanding capitalism from a man stealing artifacts, all the way up to the overarching business that drives the whole enterprise. Your job is not to catalogue these elements, but just to fill in your report. Perhaps you may come to care about these men and their stories, and perhaps capturing the tale in a book is worth doing, even if no one reads it. In the end, these people are just data points in a system that never really existed. Obra Dinn's presentation ultimately captures the instability of all this information. When you use the pocket watch, like some may have used Robert Winter's companion to the Ninth Symphony, to freeze time and create a picture of a piece, it is a moment suspended in the void, strung taut along its edges. To explore these decks as a magical observer is to being on the Obra Dinn what reading notes on a page is to hearing Beethoven. Each moment, each atomic pixel held still, an acknowledgement that all these constructs must dissolve. You will pass through the imposing memory door. You will leave the Obra Dinn. Contracts will be closed. Fees will be paid. The ship will sink. You will shut the book for the final time, and everything will be washed away as you close the game. Each scene is a magic act of suspension, like a ball in the air, like information on a drive, like each tiny star in the sky, holding fast for as long as possible before all is forgotten. Obra Dinn is a game of hypermedia, about connecting enough varied individual points to communicate something. Of course, eventually these units will fade away into insignificance, saved only as lists of names on a file, the lived experience of each component mattering only in terms of how it's affected whatever remains. HyperCard is now long discontinued, but was, of course, a major inspiration for the web browsing software that continues to shape how we interact with the internet, the largest hypermedia ocean on Earth. Lucas Pope has combined gameplay and narrative, art and sound, programming and emotion to author his Hypermedia, returning to the same passion employed years ago on his Macintosh. Not everything is lost at sea.
The way I came onto HyperCard, was really in terms of thinking about islands of information that are disparate. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm 65, I can tell things that I wouldn't told if I were earlier. HyperCard was inspired by an LSD trip. that I took on a park bench outside my house in Los Gatos. And I had taken some really nice acid, and I was, sitting up the whole night watching the stars, and I'd look up there at the stars, and I kind of looked down, and there were street lamps. And there's a parallel between the stars and the street lamps. The stars are these globs of thermonuclear energy burning, and another one over there, but they're so far apart. Many of them can't even communicate at the speed of light limitations. There's sort of, if these guys were talking to each other, they wouldn't have much of a conversation. And as I looked down at the street lamps, and I saw pools of light and another pool of light in sort of a dark area in the street, I thought about human knowledge. I thought about how the physicists know some things, and the poets know some things, and the musicians know some things, and the chemists know, and the biologists know some things. And there's a lot of paraphrasing between them, but they don't talk to each other, so they don't see the bigger picture of how they connect. And I thought, well, if you could at least facilitate this, the connection of the different bodies of knowledge talking to each other, then there's kind of a trickle-up effect that you might develop some wisdom on the planet.